It's time now for the France 24 debate. Today, it's only a war of words for now. There is considerable concern in many parts of the world as North Korea and the United States appear engaged in the highest stakes game of chicken possible, one where the ultimate threat is nuclear war. Well, Donald Trump threatened fire and fury. Pyongyang has now published details of exactly how it would shoot missiles towards the American Pacific Island territory of Guam. So, are Pyongyang and Washington serious? How far might these two nuclear-armed nations be prepared to go? And where does it leave the rest of us in France and elsewhere around the world? Our first guest in Washington, D.C., the international lawyer Nathan Park, who writes extensively on Asian affairs and politics. Thank you very much for being with us. And from Park City in Utah, Eric Schlosser, an award-winning investigative journalist who's also written extensively about the dangers of nuclear war and about miscalculation. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Schlosser.
Thanks for having me.
So let's come straight to the nub of the question. I'll come to you first, Eric Schlosser. What do you make of these new plans that we've had from North Korea for shooting missiles towards Guam? Just to reiterate, the plan is to have them shoot over Japan and impact just outside American territorial waters. Is Kim Jong-un serious?
I don't know that he's serious, but he's extraordinarily irresponsible. And it's part of a pattern of behavior. A few years ago, North Korea released a video of the destruction of the White House in Washington, D.C. by nuclear weapons. This is not wise policy from a very small, impoverished country. It's extremely irresponsible to make these sorts of threats with nuclear weapons, especially against the most powerful military nation in the world. And a nuclear war would be disastrous for both sides.
Well, Nathan Park, coming to you with the same question. Is Kim Jong-un serious?
I believe he's serious in a certain way. I'm not sure if he is serious necessarily in his intent to fire a missile to Guam, but I think he is serious in a sense that he wants to project serious power. And I would agree with Eric that it is very irresponsible for North Korea to behave this way, but that's not the same thing to say that North Korea is behaving erratically or irrationally. Ultimately, on a very high level, North Korea is a rational actor, trying to trying to ensure its survival, and they see having nuclear weapon and demonstrating nuclear capability as a way to guarantee their regime survival.
Well, in that case, I'll come back to you, Eric Schlosser. We do have Donald Trump threatening fire and fury against North Korea. That's not the kind of threat that any country would take lying down. But should that be taken seriously?
I think it was an incredibly unwise and irresponsible statement by my president. I'm a great believer in the adage of a former Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, which is to speak softly and carry a big stick. I think that these sorts of threats are not useful, and it's remarkable that the American president is imitating the rhetoric of the leadership of North Korea in making these wild threats. And just back to the earlier statement, I don't think it's a logical step for North Korea to be making these sorts of nuclear threats. North Korea has tremendous conventional military capability to destroy the capital of South Korea with artillery fire. And by getting nuclear weapons and by getting long-range missiles, North Korea is making itself a target for an American attack, which it would not have been, and it has not been, since the end of the Korean War. So I think, there is on the surface a logic, but I think it's an extremely self-destructive policy. Saddam Hussein similarly made many bluffs, and in the end was not only destroyed personally, but led to the destruction of his own country.
Well, speaking softly and carrying a big stick is one thing. Some people say, though, the United States has the arsenal to annihilate North Korea if it wanted to. This has all gone too far. And that the United States should just strike now. Nathan Park, what would you make of that opinion?
I think that would be unwise. South Korea and Japan are vital allies to the United States, and any sort of strike has a potential of utter disaster, reprise of the Korean War which killed millions. And there is something to be considered about the fact that South Korea really is the biggest stakeholder in this entire episode. People like to talk much about what North Korea is going to do, what the United States is going to do, and what China might do. But truly, South Korea is the biggest stakeholder here. And when it comes to a potential strike, South Korean interest has to be considered. I want to pick up real quick on a very good point that Eric just made about how Donald Trump's statement about fire and fury was very unwise and irresponsible, and I completely agree with that. It is a sad state of affairs where our allies feel just as allies cannot trust the United States to lead anymore. If you recall, earlier, a few months ago, Donald Trump had claimed that the USS Carl Vinson, the aircraft carrier strike team, was headed towards North Korea as a projection of power. It turns out the aircraft carrier was thousands of miles away, and that was embarrassing, to say the least, and it just does not assuage our allies into thinking that the United States is able to even competently assist defending them.
All right, well, you brought up South Korea, of course, joined to North Korea by that border and that demilitarized zone, famously. We have heard from North Korea asking both sides to tone it down somewhat. Eric Schlosser, if I come back to you, do you think that's wishful thinking at this point from South Korea?
I think that we can't control the rhetoric of North Korea, but we can certainly control the rhetoric that the American government is using. And it's especially inappropriate to be evoking nuclear destruction the same week, which is the anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States has remarkable conventional military strength, and I don't think should be making any sort of threats. If it comes time where there has to be military action against North Korea, it should be closely coordinated with South Korea and Japan. And it's so interesting that Trump was so attacking Obama about signaling moves in our attack against ISIS in Iraq. If there really is going to be some sort of military strike against North Korea, you don't want to be threatening it. You don't want to be speaking about it in advance. You just want to do it. And I think there are some scenarios in which a preemptive attack on North Korea could disable the government and could do so perhaps without hundreds of thousands of lives being lost, but it would be an extraordinarily risky move. And this matter should be settled through diplomacy, not through two inexperienced leaders making very irresponsible statements about nuclear weapons.
All right, well, let's talk diplomacy then. And North Korea has engaged in talks in the past, slightly distant past at this point, but that did lead to progress of some sorts. If I come back to you, Nathan Park, you brought up South Korea. South Korea involved in diplomacy, perhaps even some kind of a middleman between North Korea and the United States, being such a stakeholder, as we've said. Is that a possibility?
I think it is a possibility. It's somewhat of an overlooked fact that by developing nuclear weapons, North Korea is actually not doing itself any sort of favors when it comes to China. Back in April, Shen Zihua, who was the foremost historian of the Korean War in China, made waves by saying that North Korea is China's latent enemy if they continue on with their nuclear program, and South Korea may become their friends. And this sort of theme is somewhat continuing on. In the last G20 meeting in Hamburg, South Korean President Moon Jae-in and the Chinese President Xi Jinping met together, and Xi Jinping said something quite remarkable, where he quoted a phrase from Moon Jae-in's autobiography. The phrase was, "The later flow of the river pushes forward the earlier flow." which indicates that China may end up valuing the new relationship with South Korea over North Korea. So there may be an opening here. It's not entirely clear what kind of opening this will be, but I'm hopeful that South Korea will be able to find a place where its interests will align with China also, because nuclear North Korea is not in the interest of China either.
I just feel we ought to come back to this point, though, that perhaps with the various sides talking about nuclear strikes, firing missiles at each other, that diplomacy seems almost ridiculous to many minds at this point. Eric Schlosser, is there really the atmosphere currently for talk about diplomacy, for China and South Korea to try and turn the tables on this situation?
Diplomacy is all the more necessary because of this talk. I mean, we have not had a city destroyed by a nuclear weapon since 1945, and many people think that's miraculous. If a single nuclear weapon is used in conflict and destroys a single city anywhere in the world, it will change everything. And this horrible, horrible destructive power that has been restrained for 72 years will be unleashed. So diplomacy really is the only answer here. And I agree that China has to play a central role. North Korea is a small country, population of 25 million. It's an impoverished country. They have no business having a nuclear weapons program, and no business threatening Japan, threatening the United States, and threatening South Korea. That energy and that money would be much better spent in feeding the North Korean people and developing modern economy. And somebody has to tell the leadership of North Korea that that's the course they must follow, and China is the most likely country to do it.
Well, we've just got a very short amount of time, about half a minute, to come back to you, Nathan Park, on that point then. China has been North Korea's ally for years, but is North Korea interested in hearing about how it should be building up its economy and feeding its own people? Is Kim Jong-un the man to hear that message?
I am not optimistic that Kim Jong-un can be talked off of having a nuclear weapon because he would see nuclear weapon as essential to his survival. And to be completely honest, I am not entirely optimistic whether China will be able to talk Kim Jong-un into giving up the nuclear weapon. On the other hand, I am cautiously optimistic that China can join in the pressure to disarm North Korea of nuclear weapons, and I think that really might be the only path forward without risking a nuclear war.
All right, well, those looking perhaps a little bit more towards China than they were before. Thank you so much. We have run out of time, unfortunately, but I would like to thank both my guests, Nathan Park and Eric Schlosser, for joining this France 24 debate about the tensions between the United States and North Korea. That wraps up today's debate. Thanks very much for being with us, and stay tuned to France 24.